That's a great question. Growing up, I was always interested in politics. Even as a high school student, I think I had a subscription to National Review and was reading Bill Buckley, which was a little bit unusual in American high schools in the 1980s. I ended up going to a college in Ohio University, and someone said, you should study with this guy named Richard Vedder. And so I looked him up and signed up for his class, and he was an economist. And next thing you know, I was an econ major, and I just loved it from day one. Turns out that it wasn't really about politics, and what turned me on about economics was that it was not about politics. It was about the science of how markets work and how people make choices. And it turns out now I'm not very interested in politics, which is kind of ironic. The idea that you could use these powerful tools of economics, simple supply and demand, which we can teach to freshmen in a matter of a couple class periods, but that simple tool can be used to explain some of the most really interesting things: rent control, minimum wages, tariffs and quotas, things that we actually have political debates about. But the analysis of those things is really quite scientific. We have this framework for understanding how the world works. And it's a very powerful one. We can make predictions with it. For example, we know, because of supply and demand models, we know that rent controls create shortages. And sure enough, when you look out there in the real world, in places where they have rent controls, they have shortages. And to me, being able to use these tools that economists have to help explain the outside world, I found that intoxicating. It's like, this is really cool. Well, absolutely. I was reading a lot of things, actually, but the one really significant thing was in between my sophomore and junior year. Summer, I was making as much money as I could, working at a car dealership so I could buy my wife an engagement ring, or my girlfriend then. But I read Atlas Shrugged. And for me, reading Rand's, it added a component to it that I didn't get from economics. Economics taught me the tools of analyzing markets and how they work. And Rand gave me a certain fire, a certain intellectual, I guess fire is the best word. I mean, just really, now this is not just a tool to understand the world. This is a battle that is worth fighting. I had an unusual undergraduate education. At Ohio University, there's this thing called the Honors Tutorial College. It's an honors program, but it's a separate college. So I wasn't in the normal economics department. I didn't take a normal economics major. I took the Honors Tutorial Economics program, which was almost entirely tutorial based. So I didn't actually take microeconomics in a classroom with other students. I went to a professor and I said, I want to learn microeconomics. The professor would pull a book off the shelf, throw it on the desk, and I remember this one case. He threw it on the desk. He said, "Okay, come back when you know that." So I read this book, and 6 weeks later, I came back and we sat in his office and we talked about it. And I wrote a paper. So the education was considerably more liberal in the old sense of that word than the traditional education. But I took a great course in Marxist economics from a Marxist professor, economist. We read Capital. We read a lot of the great Marxist economists, Swayze, Lerner, and others. And so that was exciting. And he was a true believing Marxist. And we were reading actual we weren't reading textbooks about Marx. We were reading the actual articles and books by these scholars. And it was a baptism by fire, though. I have to say that, when a professor throws a book down on the table and says, "Come back when you're ready," it's intimidating as a freshman or a sophomore. Well, I come from a pretty poor background, and I spent a lot of time working apartment maintenance. I've shingled roofs. I've worked in restaurants and bars and waited tables and bartended in car dealerships, as I said. So I knew I didn't want to work hard for a living because I've been doing that. And I saw these, I'm no joking, but I saw these professors. I said, this is what a great job this is. You mean you get to sit around and talk about ideas with students and get paid for it? I couldn't imagine a better job. That was it. I was hooked. There's been no second thought about being a professor. I probably went in thinking I'd be a lawyer or something, but within months of being in college, I knew I wanted to be a college professor because it was so much fun. Well, by the time I got done with my undergraduate years, I was pretty much decided that I wanted to be an economist, and I wanted to be a free market economist. I mean, not that that totally defines me, but I wanted to go study with people who were pretty explicit about being defenders of free markets. And so that I looked at a lot of schools that had that. I looked at the University of Chicago. I was admitted to the University of Chicago, but they didn't give me any money, so I didn't go there. I was admitted to a lot of places like George Mason. That's pretty well known for its free market sympathies. But I chose to go to Florida State because it was about as highly ranked as George Mason, but it had a blend of free market people and a blend of a certain good number of sort of traditional non-ideological economists. I wanted to be a little bit more neutral about my training and make sure that I wasn't leaving any stone unturned when it came to my graduate education. So I went to Florida State in Tallahassee. Yeah, my dissertation was based on a book that Jim Buchanan and Jeff Brennan wrote called The Power to Tax. And in that book, they talked about a lot of things. But one of the things they talked about was how competition between governments can operate as a constraint on the ability of those governments to exercise power. And in a lot of ways, it's an analogy to the way we teach about markets. The competition in markets between business firms acts as a constraint on the ability of those business firms to exercise, power to raise prices, for example, over consumers. So the idea that the power to tax would be constrained by competition between governments was what I wrote my dissertation on. But it was an empirical dissertation. I collected data on tax rates by state, municipality, and I did one chapter was on international taxation, trying to see if governments were competing with each other and if that competition was keeping those tax rates down. I accepted my first position. I accepted a position at Shawnee State University in Ohio, a very small school. I was there for 4 years, and then I went to Capital University in Columbus, Ohio, and I was there for quite a long time, about 12 years total. And that's sort of where most of my academic career was made before I moved on. Yeah, the Economic Freedom Index, the EFW index, I started that at Florida State with Jim Gortney. Jim was I was his research assistant, and Jim came to me one day and he says, "Hey, you need to work with me on this index." And so I was working for him, and teaching assistants or research assistants lie somewhere between slaves and indentured servants. So he told me to work on it, so I said, "Yes, boss, I'm going to go work on it." Little did I know then that this would become sort of a lifetime passion to work on this Economic Freedom Index. A few years later, we published the first version, and we've been co-authors ever since. The idea of the index is to try to put a number on how economically free countries are. So we've had a lot of debates over the years about economic freedom or capitalism or free markets, but we never really had tried to measure in a quantitative way how close countries were to that sort of ideal. And so what we did is we set out to create a database that would track countries' tax rates and monetary policies and tariff policies and so on, and give them a number. So, for example, Hong Kong, approximately on a 10-point scale, gets a 9 out of 10 because today Hong Kong is probably the closest thing on earth to a free market. And then we have scale from Hong Kong all the way down to the bottom of the list is currently it's Zimbabwe, or no, Venezuela, excuse me. Venezuela is the lowest on the index now. The publisher is the Fraser Institute, and which is a think tank in Canada, in Vancouver, Canada. And they actually organized a series of conferences back in the 80s and 90s, which Jim and I latched onto to develop the idea of an index of economic freedom. So they're continuing to publish it, and it's been published every year since 1996. The audience is kind of mixed. On the one hand, it is published by a think tank. So we write the chapter and we present the data with an eye towards educated lay people, politicians, educated journalists, economics journalists, and so on. But the other audience is the academic community. This database, this Economic Freedom Index database, has become an incredibly useful tool by scholars who are doing very sophisticated, econometric statistical analyses of various things. And so it's on the one hand politicians and journalists, that's one audience, but on the other hand we have this very scholarly side to the project. And I'm kind of got a foot in both. I'm a scholar myself, so I'm writing articles and doing statistics myself. So I've got one foot in that camp, but the other foot is going out and giving lectures and talking to journalists about economic freedom. Well, the main finding is probably not too surprising to most people, and that is that countries that have more economic freedom, and that means better private property, lower taxes, more limited regulations for your trade, that those countries actually are performing on almost every measurable outcome better than countries that have higher taxes and higher regulations and more activist monetary policies and so on. I mean, the income is higher, growth is higher, investment is higher, life expectancy is longer, health is better, infant mortality is lower, poverty is lower. I mean, almost every measurable outcome you can find for any country, all the countries in the world, it looks like the countries that pursue the economic freedom path outperform the others. And that's sort of the big sort of scientific finding. That may not sound surprising to most people today, that economic freedom works, it delivers the goods. But a generation ago, this was still a hotly debated topic. A lot of people thought that central planning and activist government policies would deliver the goods. And it turns out with the data we have now, we pretty much know that's not the case. Well, it's a positive relationship. The good news is that economic freedom, capitalism, free markets, and again, no country's perfect on that, but to the extent countries pursue free markets, there's a lot of evidence that they're more peaceful as well. There's an old saying that when goods don't trade cross borders, armies do, and there's been a long-standing argument that more trade and more economic exchange generates a more peaceful relationships among people. And we actually find that in the data as well. And it's not just our study on peace. There's been several other studies that have been done by other people that have found the same result. Absolutely. In fact, the best paper on this is probably not my paper. It's a paper by a guy named Eric Gartsky. And what he found is that he used deciles, but in his case, he found that the top 10% of economic free countries were 14 times less likely, or 1/14 as likely, to have a war than the bottom decile. So there's a big differences across countries and their sort of warlike tendencies related to economic freedom. Almost no high economically free countries ever have wars. I must say, the outlier on that is the United States, which is a bit warlike and also fairly high on the index. That's a great question. Some people thought that it was democracies, because there's a lot of correlation between democracy and economic liberalism, economic freedom. But it turns out the economic freedom does dominate. Again, I'm not really sure what the theoretical or causal link is. There is the idea, though, that if you're economically free, and that means more free trade, presumably. So then you're engaging in commercial activities with your neighbors. And your neighbors they're not just the other people who live on the other side of the border. They're now my business partner in this deal for this hotel, or this deal with this mine, or this construction project. And so the domestic politics of a country, I think, probably change in a positive way, that the influential business people in the community say, hey, we don't want to have a war with that country next door, because I'm in a deal with the people over there, and they're in a deal with me. And so that's the kind of political dynamic that economic freedom probably brings. That paper with Art Carden is one of my favorite papers. Actually, in that paper, we take on a thesis that was advanced by Naomi Klein. She's a sort of public intellectual, and she wrote a book, a very influential book called The Shock Doctrine. And she argued in that book that economic freedom, economic liberalization was built on a legacy of political torture, political repression. And she used a country like Chile as an example. And it's true that Chile has a history of political repression, and it's undeniable. It also is a country that's had a lot of economic reform in the direction of economic freedom. But what we decided to do, instead of looking at one country, we decided to look at all the countries. And I'm an empirical researcher, so we have data on economic freedom. We have data on torture and political assassinations. There's a great group that's in Memphis that publishes data on this. And it turns out, again, I don't think it's surprising, but it turns out that countries that have more economic freedom, and also countries that have moved the farthest in terms of changing towards economic liberalization, in fact, they have less torture, and they have less political assassination, they have better worker rights, and the human rights records of more liberal economies and more liberalizing economies is actually a positive one, not a negative one. And so we wrote that paper to bring some empirical evidence to bear on the thesis that Naomi Klein advanced in her book. Happiness is a woozier concept indeed. I'm not in love with happiness. I mean, I sometimes joke, it's like, I'm a 4.2 today. I mean, how are you feeling? I mean, putting a number on happiness is difficult. But, you know, we put numbers on difficult things all the time. So in principle, that doesn't bother me too much. But for better or worse, there are happiness indicators out there. They're basically based on surveys of asking people how content they are. And we have these data now for long periods of time for lots of countries. And almost out of curiosity more than anything else, I figured we'd look at the Economic Freedom Index. It turns out there's some positive correlations. People who are in more economically free countries self-report themselves to be happier. I don't know if it's the freedom itself or if it's the economic growth and income that comes from freedom that they're happy about. One theory is that they just like being free people. There's a certain natural, like, I want to be free. Freedom is good all by itself. I suspect, however, that a large amount of this result is instrumental. It's being driven by the fact that, well, free economies generate high incomes, and people who have high incomes tend to report higher levels of self-reported well-being or self-contentment. And I think that's probably the explanation for that result. Yeah. Well, historical economists I've learned the most from. I mean, it's maybe a cliche, but I have to start with Adam Smith. I mean, I am an Adam Smith lover. The Wealth of Nations and Theory of Moral Sentiments are just absolutely masterpieces. And when I read them for the first time, I said, wow, this guy was really smart. He didn't have the technical jargon. He didn't know about supply and demand curves. He didn't know about indifference curves. He had no formal model of economic growth. But the way he wrote and is really intoxicating to me. I had to be fair, though. He would write something for 2 pages that I would just reread over and over again and just love. And then it'd be 40 pages of stuff that I thought was boring. But then there'd be another 2 pages that were just, wow, that is great. One of the great metaphors that he uses, I still think of it. I think of it almost every day. It's in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, where he talks about a man of system. And he criticizes people who believe that you can arrange the members of society the way you arrange the men on a chessboard. And this image I have of central planners, sort of big hands sort of moving down and moving us around and telling us what to do, that image stuck with me. I thought it was an elegant way to bring that out. So Smith is first and foremost. Other than that, it's hard to say. I think Milton Friedman was a great influence. I had the the luxury of getting to know Milton. He was involved in the Economic Freedom Project in the very beginning. It was really his idea to do it. And so I met him, was at his house, and when I think of my own career, and to put me in Milton Friedman's category is just, it's a joke. I mean, he's a giant, Nobel Prize winner, smartest person I've ever met. But I do sort of think of Milton Friedman's career as being first and foremost a great economist, a Nobel Prize winning economist, but also a public economist who comes out of the ivory tower and is willing to engage the wide world of ideas. He's not just going to write articles and books for other economists to read. And so the work with the Economic Freedom Index is a lot like that. I think of it as a scholarly project where I want other economists, other academics to pay attention to, but I also want journalists and politicians and people to learn from that index. So I've kind of modeled myself after Milton Friedman there, and it's kind of a joke because he was, compared to me, a giant. I mean, I can think of Hayek. Certainly has a great influence, but I don't think of him as being somebody I think of every moment of every day, like I think of Adam Smith even. I learned a lot from some of the Austrian economists beyond Hayek. I mean, I don't consider myself an Austrian economist. I'm not trained as one. I haven't read the full canon of Austrian literature like some people have. But Mises was a great economist, and Human Action is a great book. And I think almost every economist today, whether they call themselves an Austrian or not, would agree with 99% of that book. It's just basically, it's good economics. It's good, solid analytical economics. So that's certainly probably is the next best choice. Historical economists who I disagree the most with, well, I mean, obviously you could pick low-hanging fruit like Marx, but let me avoid that one. You know, in the 20th century, one economist that I have a lot of respect for, but who I think was wrong on a lot of issues was Galbraith. John Galbraith was an economist, by most accounts anyway, an economist, and incredibly influential. And I respect him, and I read Galbraith, and he almost convinces me that he's right every time. He was such an elegant writer and such a clear thinker. But I think he was fundamentally wrong on a lot of things. I mean, for example, he really thought advertising was an insidious force in market economies. He thought advertising almost mesmerizes consumers to go buy things that they don't really want. And when you read his attacks on advertising, it's very persuasive. It's like, yeah, man, those advertisers, they fool us. And then I close up his book and I reflect. I said, no, actually not. Most of advertising is telling us that toothpaste is available for $2.99 at the Kroger, and it's available at $3.19 at the Publix or whatever the other grocery store is. And it's about providing information to consumers. It's not so, advertisers in fact don't have the power over us that Galbraith thought. And the world is littered with failed advertising campaigns. You know, you can look at New Coke. I mean, one of the most celebrated advertising campaigns of the 20th century, where Coke tried to rebrand itself, and it was a flop. Within weeks, they had to back off of that. So, you know, advertisers themselves will tell you that they don't have nearly as much control over consumer behavior as they'd like to, and I think Galbraith was wrong on that. Even though he was persuasive, he told a good story. Well, I mean, I think economics as a profession is well, I wouldn't say at a crossroads, but that's probably too extreme. The economics profession for the last 20 years has undergone a formalism revolution. That is to say, the things we used to say in the 40s and 50s and even 60s in English in words, in the 70s and 80s and 90s, we had to translate into fancy Greek symbols and equations. And so that revolution, that formalism revolution, dominated. And that was, for the most part, pretty benign. It really didn't change economics much. One of the things that I'm seeing now in economics is a move towards empiricism that is, I think, on one hand very encouraging, and on the other hand perhaps not so much. But the encouraging thing is that we're not just playing with calculus and Greek symbols on formal models. That formalism revolution is largely kind of coming to an end. People aren't really working on that now. And instead they're going out to the real world and saying, hey, let's look at some phenomena that are occurring and see if we can explain them with the data. So really, the work of Steve Levitt at University of Chicago, for example, the Freakonomics book is an example. I don't actually agree with everything in the book, but it's an example of the kind of new innovative economics that's being done, that's data-driven and empirical, and not so just purely formal. And that's, I think, encouraging. That doesn't mean I agree with all the things that are being done out there by everybody, but that's the new wave, and that's where I think economics is going. And I think the Economic Freedom Index is a part of that. It's at the more macro level, but trying to treat the development of economies as an empirical problem. It's not really a theoretical problem. Well, it is a theoretical problem, but it's also something that we can use data and evidence to help us learn a lot. And so that's the big change, I think. Well, economists are terribly bad about being, we're not introspective at all about our methodology. And in fact, if you want to not get tenure as an economist, you should write on methodology. It's not something that most economists find interesting. Milton Friedman did write some very good stuff on methodology, and some of the greats in the profession have done so. I don't think it's been a shift in methodology. The basic methodology of economics is sort of a Popperian empiricism. We have theory and we test, theory and test. Now, not all economists buy this. The Austrians frequently will rebel at that framework. But you state a hypothesis, you gather some evidence, and you test the evidence that you find against that hypothesis. And then, depending on how that turns out, you adjust the hypothesis. You accept, you reject, and that's how the process is supposed to work. So I don't think that it's been a huge methodological change. It's just that most of the theoretical work has been done. There isn't, that's hard. The theoretical stuff has been done, and so the work is mostly being done on the testing side, on the empirical side. Okay, let's see if we can find some data, find something going on in real estate markets, and for example, and see if we can apply that well-known theory to that area. And then, hey, that theory works there too, because it worked in the other 45 studies that were done testing that theory. But that's the kind of thing I think that you're seeing. It's not that we've changed the methodology, it's just that we've moved to that we're more like lab rats now than we're applied physicists now more than we were than theoretical physicists. The theoretical part of economics is not done. We're not done with it, but not as many people are doing it as before. Well, I think one criticism. Well, I don't think this criticism is really spot on. But one criticism that I hear that I actually have some sympathy for is the argument that better numbers on an economic freedom index are not necessarily better. The economic freedom index measures how economically free a country is, and I think it does a pretty good job of that. And I think even our opponents will agree. Hong Kong is number one because Hong Kong is the most free economy. Venezuela is at the bottom, 152 out of 152, because it's pretty much the most socialist economy. So I don't think too many people disagree with the scale as we've measured it. They disagree with the normative conclusion that being higher on the scale is more desirable than being lower on the scale. And so one criticism that we get frequently is, well, that's great, thanks for telling us that Hong Kong is freer than Venezuela, but Venezuela is better. Now, that's a reasonable position to have. It's reasonable to argue that higher numbers are not better. But then I think the onus should be on, okay, well, do you know that higher numbers also correlate with faster growth and less mortality and higher life expectancy and all these other things? So we don't get many criticisms on the numbers per se. In fact, people who are sort of ideological opponents, socialist, left-wing type economists, or people in other disciplines like political science who are clearly not really ideologically interested in free markets. They will use the index. They acknowledge that it measures what it measures. They just aren't quite ready to believe that it's a good thing. That's a reasonable criticism, because the index itself is pretty value neutral. It just measures economic freedom. It doesn't say anything about whether more or less is good or bad. Prior to having an index of this type, we had a normative debate about freedom being good or bad too, but it was taking place in a sort of an empirical vacuum. Whereas now, at least, we have some empirical evidence that we can turn to help inform that normative debate. Well, there aren't too many professional economists who will say much about freedom, as a normative good in and of itself. It's just not something that's on the radar screens of economists. But there are a lot of economists that have used the Economic Freedom Index as an explanatory variable to some other thing that economists are interested in. Economists are interested in economic growth. We're interested in income. We're interested in investment. We're interested in even on some social dimensions, life expectancy and health and so on. And lots of economists, literally hundreds and hundreds of studies have been done and use the Economic Freedom Index as a part of the explanation for those things. Now, so they're not interested in freedom per se necessarily. Some people are, but most economists are not. They're interested in growth. And they're searching for things that give us growth. And they discover through their research that economic freedom is one of them. Among most economists who study it, the belief is very strong. There are a lot of people who study growth who simply don't want to touch something that looks politically too political. So they're going to try to, they would probably say, oh, we're going to stick to fundamentals. We're going to avoid politics. But it's funny, they don't, in real life, we all sort of have an understanding that politics and the political system and the economic systems matter. In political science, for example, the empirical political science literature is filled with studies of democracy. The political system, the nature of the political system affects all kinds of outcomes. The political scientists study this. It's kind of odd that a lot of economists are unwilling to sort of admit that the economic system, that the rules and regulations and the rules of the game in the economic system will have big impacts on the economic outcomes. But again, I'd say that probably half of growth economists are well familiar with this argument and believe it's a true result. So I mean, it's not totally bleak. I'm afraid yeah, I think that is the case, that there is economists like to think of themselves as physicists or chemists, and we're just out there dispassionately studying the world as it is. And if the conclusion is that more economic freedom yields more growth, that starts to sound dangerously close as advocating for more economic freedom. And in the eyes of a lot of economists, that crosses a sort of a methodological barrier that they don't want to cross. I don't see why that should be the case. It's still a scientific finding. It doesn't necessarily mean you are in favor of it. It's just a scientific finding. Any more than, for example, there's all kinds of good studies on democracy. Democracies really do outperform autocracies on a lot of different outcomes. Doesn't necessarily mean you're for democracy, although I think it probably does end up meaning that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. But economists, much more so than the other social sciences, want to act like we're not in that type of game. Well, this is probably self-serving, but I really do think ideas matter, and ideas have consequence. I am not terribly sympathetic or interested, certainly myself, in direct engagement with the political process. I tend to think that politicians, and politicians certainly matter, but politicians for the most part are reacting to the ideas that are lying around in the culture. Whenever there's a crisis or a political decision to be made, they base their decisions on the sort of dominant ideology of the time. And by the time a politician's in office, it's kind of too late to do anything good with him. He is what he is, or she is what she is. What's more important is to create a cultural shift in the climate of ideas. And so that's why I think the academic work and the work with students is in the long run more likely to sort of yield fruit. It's also self-serving because I'm a professor and that's my job is to teach students, but I think in the long run it's very effective. Direct advocacy certainly has a role here and there. It's just not something that I'm very good at, and I also think it tends to give you short-run gains, but not really long-run victories.